Oh, sounds like someone got some mail. All right. I mean, that was so fun. We wanted to play it again. Happy CultureCast Day, everybody. Happy day after US Tax Day. And most importantly, welcome to my fabulous CultureCast guest today, Ambassador Shabazz. I am so fired up to have you join me in this conversation today, Ambassador. Amazing. How are you today?
I'm fine, and thank you, Lady Andrada, for inviting me.
Oh my goodness. Now, okay, where are you today? Where in the world is Ambassador?
Well, I am 6 hours now back in the United States, happening to be in Louisville, Kentucky, of all places.
Amazing. That's right. That is your pass through stomping ground when you're not in Belize.
Correct. For about 14 years, though. I mean,
Oh my
so
goodness.
yeah.
Amazing. Well, I don't know that you need an introduction, but I will do one quickly, anyways. I am so excited to see you again. We had such an amazing conversation the last time you and I connected. And then the first time we met, which was in Washington, D.C., on February 13th, the day before Frederick Douglass's birthday, and the gathering of all of these amazing descendants of civil rights leaders. And I guess we'll start there. You are the eldest daughter of another lady boss, Dr. Betty Shabazz,
Correct.
and Malcolm X. I
Correct.
don't know that I need to say any more than that because I want to dive into that. But it is amazing to not only, and I want to dive into who they are and their legacy, but then more importantly, who you are and your legacy. And so, thank you so much for joining me on this culture cast. And I just want to throw in a comment here too. I know I was rocking to the music a little bit. Um, Ambassador, you also met my dear friend and colleague Mike Miller in DC. His son-in-law is a music producer, and threw that together, and I just love
Oh,
it.
wonderful.
So Julius Wilder here in Nashville pulled that together. So thank you, Julius, as always, for capturing the spirit of the energy of our guests when we're at CultureCast. So, Ambassador, I want to start with, first of all, reminding people why we have these conversations to begin with. I've had the fortunate opportunity to meet with leaders all across different industries. And the whole notion is to help our audience and our followers just really help them cultivate environments where within their community or within their companies that everyone can thrive. And
Correct.
the idea is like every leader that I meet with, given their perspective, it just gives amazing insight and inspiration for people to do that. And I think just being around your energy, just physically and virtually, I always feel that, wow, I can go and do better and be better. So I want to jump into like your upbringing. I mean, I think you are a global citizen, but I want to hear about young ambassador, pre-ambassador. Like, what was it like growing up?
Well, first of all, again, thank you.
Yeah.
And I did all but restrain myself not to dance on camera because I am naturally percussionally musical,
I
and
bet you
I
are.
didn't need to introduce myself in that light just now. Um, and also, thank you for not only today and inviting me, but also the work you do. That's what made me say yes to today. I think those that circle in these spaces look for authentic ways to move the pendulum. And at this age and stage of my life, and it's with great exposure to many variables, I actually just simply trim it down and elect to be around those who are doing the work in their way. It's always exciting for me to see that variable show up, those characteristics
Wow.
show up. And it's an affirmation to that which my parents, mother, father, and their parents stood for. It seems idealistic to some, but it's affirming for me as I approach 70.
Oh my goodness. First of all, you look amazing. If that is your earth age, I love that. And thank you. I come from a very authentic place. And as you and I have discussed, it's not about me, But my story, I think it's personal for me. And it
Mhm.
is about how you create a space for people where they belong, where there's access and equity to what they do. And so thank you for the acknowledgement. And I want to go back to really young ambassador. Tell me about, this family you were born into. And that's right. We talked about the influence of your grandmother as well. Uh,
Grandparents on both sides. I mean, my parents happen to be who people know this generation,
yeah.
but they are the descendants. That's why I say it's in the DNA and the nature. Otherwise, I would have had a smart job with a pension. I'd be a senior citizen with a pension as opposed to trying to, find the pieces. But my fulfillment and my currency comes from the work that I've just been blessed to be born into. That was exampled also,
Yeah.
the choices that they made, not the headline affirmations or statements, because they, believe it or not, they don't match what I
Yeah.
know, what I live. And so my work always includes, before anyone knew my name at all, is what's your authentic paragraph? Or how do you identify yourself and how do you preserve that identity? Period. Because the one-liners don't always fit. And people can't help it. They excerpt what they do and they give that life.
Hmm.
But sometimes we acquiesce to that misnomer, right? And you want to say, no, I think I feel much healthier over here, even if it means isolation or fewer friends or not
Yeah.
being a member of the club. What I also find is that there's always someone around that is just like you, who's a great natural member to your rhythm, so to speak. And so for me, I have grandparents, great grandparents. We're all very different. None of my grandparents are the same. Their origins, their backgrounds, their theologies. I grew up very ecumenical, very cross cultural. So when I
Yeah.
use the word culture, it's not just race specific, but it is
Yeah.
origin, narrative to those origins, the folklore of those origins, and the passed down language of those origins. And I feel an allegiance to the preservation of all of those things. And having grown up in New York, one, having been exposed to, my father's only first generation American, which people don't realize. So
Wow.
his mother spoke five languages. I mean, so I really did grow up in a kind
Yeah.
of potpourri environment. And then being in New York, it means it's a natural place. And having gone to the United Nations International High School, that was reality. That
Yeah.
is reality for me. And as we are now in a place, decades later, learning ourselves in context of the world, it's a natural place. So I love being able to curate that, which introduces people to their yesterday selves and connect that to today.
Oh my gosh, I love this. I mean, there's so much to unpack with just what you've introduced. And I love what you said about what is your authentic paragraph and actually helping people find that. And it feels like hearing about both sets of grandparents and how each and every one of them were very different from each other. And then, of course, being a daughter of a first generation
Mhm.
American, right, immigrant to the United States and having to find your path, I think you were naturally able to actually sit in a very diverse situation from as far back as you can remember. Like, I think that's a unique upbringing.
Well, I think many
Yeah.
people have those components. It's just that we're robbed of them. We're forced to have to choose one.
Yeah.
That's the
Interesting.
difference, I think, with my four parents. So no one was asked to deny the other. If I was visiting one grandparent's house, I didn't have to forfeit any part of myself. If I was around, I mean, once my father was gone, my mother said, "Thank God my husband internationalized me," because that's where was able to assess that. And that's how I went to the UN school, as a wish that he had already had. So she was able to understand the value of it. So in my family, I was fortunate to have people who may have been different from one another,
Mhm.
but learn from everyone, from the cross section, so that being firstborn, at least before people got tired, I was
Yeah.
able to be the beneficiary of those open lenses, right? And
Yeah.
apprehensive and concerned at times, when you have a child charting a course that is not popular in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s.
Sure.
But I was fine in my skin.
Yeah. I think that's what a lot of people are looking for in any decade of their life, is
Yeah,
to actually be fine in their skin.
correct,
And
correct.
so, and I want to dive into some of the work that you've done to really help influence and mentor young people to actually find their way. But I kind of want to get into, because I'm curious. I don't know if we've ever talked about this. At what point in your young life did you connect the dots to your father and your mother being civil rights leaders? Like, when was that moment for you that you're kind of like, oh, they are influencing hearts and minds of people around the world?
Um, you know, my parents were young when I entered their
Yeah.
lives, and they were surrounded by many. The one thing about being born or raised in the 50s and 60s, you weren't alone in that work,
Hmm.
right? It's you weren't singular in that work. It was the era and time of social change. Not that we didn't have it in generations prior, but that was really a time where Gen Zers of the day, which my parents
Yeah.
fit into, many of the people we recognize today, from Bob Dylan to Nina Simone in terms of music and song, from Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, my father, even the Kennedys. It's like it was the era, it was the period where lyrics became mainstays to one's life. They weren't just songs to sing, but they were
Yeah.
anthems of sort. So I was just fortunate to be born at a time where it was the social collective, the free love movement, the equity movement. We didn't have to ask, what does equity stand for? You didn't have to say DEI before everything. It was an understanding that
Yeah.
peace is better than war. Period. That's what the Vietnam War was about. That's what Muhammad Ali spoke. He was a 22-year-old. So I'm just, I think, in terms of time of life, born in a place where what my parents represented and their parents before them was being manifested, or we were aiming to. Even when you think about a Norman Lear, so
Yeah.
people would create based on the issues. The Smothers Brothers, who were canned, because of
Yeah.
it, but everybody was in it. Everybody was involved, one way or the other, of trying to figure out how to manifest or realize what humanity's equity should look like.
Yeah. Wow. And I love how you coined the phrase too, that that was just a way of life and a way of being. And I do love the idea of songs and lyrics, but more specifically, songs becoming anthems
Yes.
to how people live their life or want to live their life. And I so relate to that, in that, I think about my dad and his upbringing. And when he came to the United States, he always associated kind of a period of time of when things were happening that were pivotal for him,
Mhm.
always related it to a song. And then, interestingly, we called them anthems to
Yeah.
how he lived his life. So fascinating that you said that. I know you've already answered this question, but one of the questions I always ask people when I have leaders on my CultureCast is, how do you define culture? And I love that you said that it's many things, right? It's origin, it's narrative, it's folklore. So, how would you describe that to, say, a young leader coming up in their community or in an organization today? How would they relate to that in their surroundings today? What should they be thinking about when you say that origin, narrative, and folklore? What should that mean to them?
Well, first of all, you have to listen,
Okay.
because culture is not monolithic, and it's going to show up many ways, even in the same household. Interpretations, how it fits one's nature. Culture should be one's way of being, and not an assignment. It's how you proclaim, not how you are assigned.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding, we come from a culture. I'm an American born. I'm also a New Yorker. I'm also a Caribbean. So there are little bits and pieces of that. And as a result of being a comfortable listener and a surrenderer and curious about cultures, plural, I can actually be in anyone's house or table and roll with it. And I'm very often the only one at a Passover dinner. I may be the only one that looks like me. I kind of look like Pharaoh at the table.
Yeah.
So when they're talking about Pharaoh, I have to look left and right. But I understand it from the Old Testament perspective, and I
Okay.
appreciate what it is as much as who I am as a person descendant on my grandmother's side of Islam, and from a modern narrative, in an inclusive narrative, in an all faiths narrative. So for me, and thank God for my parents and grandparents before them, that we were exposed to everything and everybody, and you just had to listen. My grandmother, actually, in the 20s and 30s, used to take her children on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday randomly to different holy houses.
Wow.
Well, yeah, this is back then, my father's childhood, and my father's
Yeah.
number 4 of 8. And on the way home, my uncle said she would then ask all of her children, "What did you glean from that worship service?" And they would share the variables. Some were more animated, some
Yeah.
were quiet, some were. And what they would always come to the center of is that faith. And different people showed it different ways. So I come from those who understand that core and who passed that on. My father was one who did pray 5 times a day, but he didn't make it mandatory for us. But having witnessed it, we did pray before all meals. We did pray for graciousness or thanks,
Yeah.
things like that, but not necessarily the rhythm of 5 times a day. And so to be around one who lives it is one of those things, but doesn't command it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I think your upbringing, and I think it's just diversity in action without using the word diversity. You were around just so many different upbringings and backgrounds. And I love the story that you shared about grandparents just taking each of the grandchildren or the children to different houses of faith every weekend to get that exposure. And then hearing them think about, okay, here's the differences, but then at the core of it all is faith, and how that's kind of what brings people together. And then
Well,
I'm,
sure.
I'm hearing, yeah,
No,
go
I
ahead.
say, and my grandmother didn't tell them what they should think. So that's just
Yeah,
it. It was, what did you get from that? I mean, from 10 years old, for about I don't know, a few summers, I was in Quaker camps. So we did Vespers. What a cool thing to understand that silence is power. I mean, just to be
wow,
exposed to the variety. And also by 10, 11, I had my naming ceremony as a Cherokee. None of those introductions, as an Afro-Cherokee American,
yeah,
but none of those eclipsed any of the other things. That's what I said. You can be 100% all of your stuff,
yeah,
right? And the more you get to learn about them, the fuller, the more round, the more understanding you are to other people, even in theirs, even if you don't possess or have the same characteristics that they may have, you will understand it, you'll appreciate it.
yeah. I love that actually as advice. And I feel like I try and practice that, having worked in corporate settings, startup settings. But what you said is just being able to listen,
Listen,
right? Observe, be present, as well as be curious, right? And I think you said this, be curious about cultures, about everything else, but then for yourself, to not exclude yourself because you learn one thing and then shut off because now there's this one thing to be true, because there's other things that also can be true
and
if
it
you think
changes.
about the curiosity, and it
It's going to be
changes, right?
very mercurial. You'll call upon all kinds of things at different times, and you'll find a home for it, in order to comfort you or inspire you.
Yeah. And I think too, it's just a good lesson too about the ability to do that, is to be curious about yourself,
Yeah.
first, before you're just curious about the world and people around you. Yeah. I'm listening to you and I think about how that act on its own, like that behavior on its own, actually creates an environment of presence and of people who are willing to co-create and work together because of that openness, right? And the curiosity. I
Sure.
love
And
that.
manifests as a result. is what brings me joy. I was telling someone who's 25, who was about to graduate from Harvard University, that me at my age, part of the excitement is knowing that every day you can learn something new. He was feeling the stress of making a new
Yeah.
decision after graduation. Slow down, wait. As long as you live on Earth, there's going to be a new evolution, and you want to be buoyant and ready enough to really jump on board or consider it. And if it doesn't fit, know yourself well enough to know that it doesn't fit. And I'm at those phases and stages in my life as well, where only now with the affirmation that you can get to a certain age and there's more.
Yeah. I love that. Well, let's talk about all of these young adults, young teenagers, adolescents that you mentor. We had this interesting conversation about early on with young people, like making sure that they get a passport. So say
Yeah.
more about that.
Well, I think everyone. So it's not, for me, young means everyone.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many of those teenagers whose parents don't have passports. It's amazing when I am doing advisories for corporations, how many serve a greater population from whom they expect a
Yeah.
revenue share from, but don't know anything about those demographics. And they don't have a passport, have never gone on a cruise to the close Caribbean or to Toronto. Or Mexico. You need a
Yeah.
passport to move around and not have even realized the value. The passport is a cost, it's like $150. So
Yeah.
for an adult, that's $15 a year because it lasts 10 years. For young people, I want to do it so that they don't get lost or stuck in a zip code. I want to make sure that whether
Yeah.
they make it to a university or college or higher education, that they're ready for a job or an experience in as many places. We're trying to do it before they turn 18, when they're still in high school, so that it positions them. And as a result, one of those mechanisms through the Humanity Passport Project is to make sure their paperwork is in order. So that for us means, especially if you're in the tri-state area, first and second and third generation Americans whose parents have to understand permanent residency,
Yeah.
naturalization, all of those things that are, that get lost in the paperwork. And we want to make sure that they do not turn 18 without having all of those things in order. That's American kids and international kids in America.
Yeah. That's really smart. I think about, the process that my husband went through to actually get his passport in another country because his grandparents, were born in another country. And
Right.
the importance of doing that. But then for his daughter, right, my stepdaughter, in order to do that, like when he did that, making sure that she also gets that passport before the age of 18, because then that opportunity is lost.
Yeah, it's lost and it's frightening. We see how litigious it becomes. I know adult people who have knots in their stomach, who are in fetal positions because they've passed the age or the duration of when their parents became or were able to, and are stuck. And we are not friendly at that clerk desk. We will stamp denied. And there are people who feel at home here in the United States and should be able. That's what the
Yeah.
country presents. When I was at the United Nations International School, the school starts at pre-K. And there are kids who were there because their parents worked at the United Nations for all years of school, from 5 or 4 to 18, and then learned at 21 or 22, when their parent passed away or was no longer working, retired, that they didn't have status. This is, of course, in the 70s or 80s, and devastating to watch
Yeah.
people for whom this is home and they don't have the proper documentation to protect them in a place that says come one, come all, right? So
Yeah.
I've lived with and around it. People ask me if my grandmother wasn't, I don't know why it would be a precursor, but they would ask me, was she naturalized? Well, yes, she was naturalized. I mean, why? What is that a prerequisite question
Yeah.
for? But she always kept her accent. She was always very much an international woman. I am her, so I walk with her culture,
Yeah.
mindful of it and the variety of what's included in that culture, and that she wanted me to make sure my pilgrimages, plural, were actualized. And so while I curate these delegations, not just for young people, everyone, just
Yeah.
some people need a break and they need to have a different lens of who they are. And other places do not always grade and dismiss one. And I think we live too often feeling as if we don't feel up to par. And that's
Yeah.
why the discussion of diversity, who's discerning yes or no with diversity, equity, and inclusion? Who are we getting approval from? That's predetermined. So, I mean, your value is predetermined. It exists. You were born with
Right.
it, right?
That's right.
So the fact that it's still up for question, up for approval, up for grants, up for this, it's an notion to me. It's like it's colonial or
Wow. Right. Yeah, actually, that is profound to say that. And I think it goes back to what you said at the very, very beginning, which I'd love to also unpack as you work with adults of all ages. But I also have heard this theme of just really making sure you get to young people before they become adults just because they're so impressionable. But it is about what is your authentic paragraph. I love the way that you say that.
Well, and the reason why this is important with adults is
Yeah.
that you have executives in leadership, which is the work that you're in, who never had those questions answered,
Yeah.
right? And so that they're charting their data based on something else, not even the human resources that may be around them in their particular cubby or division, that everyone in their division merits something. So what is that? When I used to train corporations, would be in the 70s, 80s, about how to listen to the people already around them, that the
Hmm.
assets already exist. So removing people, demoting people, not thinking to train people or placing people or hiring people in the area where they excel, not just based on their curriculum vitae, but based on that hobby line, you
Yeah.
know, based on the skill sets, based on the intrigues, based on the interests. And then you get to really know the bounty that you have in your space. But this feeling that people always imagine that they are dispensable. Oh, that's so horrible to me.
Yeah, it is horrible. And I think about my own career journey, having um, entered my career in the 90s, right? And I think it started in the 80s, in the 90s, or early 2000s, where it was the opposite of what you're explaining in terms of what corporations were all about. I think about my early days in corporate America, and I don't even know how I was employed in Fortune 50, like early days, where it was all about here is, our success profile. Here are the values. And in order for you to be successful, in this organization, and if you want to see a long, a longevity or a long career here, this is how you behave, right? This is how you dress. This is how you speak. This is how you act. And it's actually removing people from their authentic selves. And anytime you would deviate, then that would not be success, or you would not be successful at a company, you
Correct.
know? And so it's interesting how, the world goes full circle. And I think we're kind of back to that now. And if I come back to this authentic paragraph, I'm curious, has yours continued to evolve? So if you were to define the ambassador's authentic paragraph when you were, you know, just beginning your career, in the 20s and 30s, is that the same, or has it evolved to what it is now?
Well, it's interesting. When I started at, let's say, 19 to 25, I had jobs.
Yeah.
My nature is what defines what one would align with career now. So that always existed. It just was not, people wanted you to fall into the professional categories and the lines.
Yes.
My roles in each of those places were always the same. Whereas where we called it in the 70s or 80s, the conflict resolution or whatever, it was always that. And part of that for me was how people, how would I say, identified and discerned what was working and not
Okay.
just was not working, right? And that if a person is showing up in a certain way, there may be other reasons why. So I didn't
Yeah.
always spend as much time on the negative or the disposable, but would extract from that, because maybe that person doesn't know what the benefit looks like. And you
Yeah,
can't expect people to do the work just based on description if they've never experienced the value of outcome.
that's
Uh,
right.
right? So you have to somehow or another enable people to be the beneficiaries of that which you want them to produce.
I agree. I love this tying it to having that experience tied to outcomes. And if they haven't had that, then there's this hesitancy. And I always kick it pretty broad when I talk to leaders about, the ideal vision that I have around what does it mean to create belonging and what does it mean to um, be inclusive. And I think it's about, if a leader or a human being, especially in the context of an organization or a community organization, I think the definition of that is the role of the leader, the primary role of the leader is to inspire confidence in that other human being that they are responsible for from a work standpoint, right? So if they're supporting that person, they're that person's leader, that when you inspire confidence in that other human being on who they are, right? And that allows that person to actually then show up confident in who they are, which might be very different from everyone else around them, including the leader to whom they report. That then unlocks the possibility of them like bringing all of it, right? Bringing all of what they think, all of what they feel, which I think is missing in the opportunities I think that organizations have. And I love your multidimensional, like when you allow for everything to exist, at least, and find a way for people to harmonize. Not everyone's going to agree. I think that then unlocks the possibilities of ideas that companies are missing out on, right? Energy that we are missing out on because we're not allowing for that. And I don't really think of that.
And if you're a division head, a department head,
Yeah.
or executive, then it is sometimes zeroing in what makes the person for whom you submit these answers to, what makes them happy,
Yes.
what intrigues them, what's their fancy, right? What gives them a blush? What's the warm
What's
and
their
fuzzy?
fancy?
Yeah.
Yes.
What's the warm? What's the blush? Right. And if you can balance that, then you're often entrusted to do the innovative.
Yeah.
Right. But it has to be recognizable what you're delivering. Cannot be like just hammered. It has to be offered,
Yeah.
promoted, welcomed.
Now
And
I
it's not
want,
easy. It's
yeah,
not easy.
it's
But if you're a listener, you kind of learn the language. It's like sign language.
That's right. I think you're right when you are a listener. And I think the other piece too is, and when others experience you to be open and curious, then that happens,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
I
they
think
don't
that
feel out of
happens.
place. I think even those to whom you answer to have issues of fulfillment and inadequacies and balance. Um, so we're all human in this wheel. It's just, what role do you play in fulfilling that goal? And if it's not a good place for you, make a new decision.
Yeah, I love that. What role do you play? And we are all humans. And I think we have to give grace to people when we put our expectations on them, when they're really of ourselves. That's what I
Correct.
think.
Yeah, right,
Right, right.
right.
Um, I want to talk about what you shared with me too, your Ours project, and how you're going to empower 10 million people across 10 cities globally, 10 cities in the US. Talk more about that project and how those participating in this conversation right now, how they can get involved.
Well, it's interesting. The Hours Project was born of one particular period, era, time a few years ago, but it's still the nature of me, right? No matter
Yeah,
what I'm creating, it is about the collective. And Ours, as you know, means Our United Reclamation Shared. And it was during 2020 when people were really at their emotional wits end. It wasn't just the strife of the streets and COVID. Whatever had not been healed prior to that isolation
yeah,
was showing up. And we started to find holistic healing ways. And as my dad's, but not just holistic healing in the warm and fuzzy, but really application. How do you make a difference? And less is more. That's what we had to adhere to during 2020, during the pandemic and the isolation. You realize you didn't need a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
We could minimize. And then once you minimized and identified the signature of value, you can maximize from that place. So we started to renovate depressed neighborhoods and make sure that people who actually were pretty doing very well in their jobs, making a decent American salary, somewhere between 65 and 125,
Yeah.
but still had bad credit, a lot of debt, universities and all of those things. We started to shift them because they were already leaders. They were commanding in their jobs. They were head of households, but just were falling short. And we, within a 6-month period, had 9 new homeowners.
Wow.
Same amount of rent that they're paying for mortgage, but now they're investing in themselves. And then the other statement is, if you have children, put their names on it. So now you've taken care of 2 generations. Now you've created a legacy. So I knew that as we were fulfilling those things, and one of those persons has bought 3 properties since. Another one was only 30 and bought her grandmother's house. The grandmother was very emotional because she said, in a matter of years, I'll be in an assisted living, and they'll take this house I've raised my children and grandchildren from and use it towards that bill. But now my baby has it. So we just realized it was all doable. Little work, little taming, little diet, meaning you don't need this card and a that card and a that card. We're going to do a little and change your credit. You're in charge of your credit. You can watch your credit go like this. You know exactly. And giving people that power, because usually you think it's someone else controlling all of those things. And so we chose people who were already doing things so that they could start creating neighborhoods and informing others. From that, I knew as we were approaching my dad's 100th birthday in 2025, that this was a doable mission. Not that I didn't already agree or know it or foresee it, but that would enable me to not just have a party or shindig for his 100th birthday, but impact lives and deliver outcomes, beneficiaries. So if I'm speaking to my dad on that day, I speak to him all the time, but on that day, say that your life was not for naught, that it's doable. What is that plan? And some of us are more equipped than others. So what is that time? So we determine currency, not just by cash, but by time, training, engagement, encouragement. And so we are in different countries, different states, and those epicenters to reach the 10 million, arbitrary number. But it is not me knowing each of the 10 million. It is reaching the pinnacles, those who are around and who could reach. It could be the theologians in their spaces on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It could be superintendents of schools who are responsible for 20,000 lives, and so forth and so on. And what can my colleagues and friends do to make sure that no one is left behind in those charges? Not to write a new law, but looking at the line items to see what needs to be moved. When we take young people, I'm just coming back from Belize with a delegation of 14 who never left, who didn't realize the value of that travel. And they already know it's what they're going to do next year. And when they go into college, just because they were at home, you have to introduce it in a way where you're not a stranger and where you're going welcomes you. And we want to do more and more of that so that young people know that they do not have to adhere to any kind of limitations. They just have to prepare by any means necessary for all of the things and aspirations that they want to fulfill.
So to get involved in the Ours Project, and you're right, it's like someone who's at the center of communities, organizations, and it is about how can they help elevate people, right? Like help them elevate them to a next level in their life. That's how they can get involved. Like, for example, I know that you met this person briefly. You had a brief conversation when we were all together in Washington, D.C. Someone who I adore and someone who I believe is a mentor to me is the president of Cal Poly Pomona. So California State Polytechnic University, there's 25,000 students. It's 70% diverse and often first gen, American students attending. That's my undergrad. Like, what can Dr. Coley and her team do to really make an impact for not only those students, but their families too?
Well, first of all, on their campuses, I just finished doing a 3-year project at Los Angeles City College, and you want to say there's the academic structure, but
Yeah.
who's there? It's in the cross sections is geographically located amidst 4 different demographics, the representation of all flags that are present, the grandparents that are just a reach away, that you have to make sure that you have a place on a campus that is not just foreign language study,
Yeah.
but global culture representation. There are 365 days to celebrate all things. Look to the left and the right of you and discern who's present in the room. We know the American holidays that we take off, but what's going on in the room, in my office, in my division, in my campus, where I can acknowledge other people based on who they are. Because I guarantee you, when they leave at 5 or 6 o'clock, they're going to resume those cultures. Are we involved? Have we learned anything about it? When it comes to Dr. Coley, who is very warm, I can't wait to have a conversation with her because I can be broad about it, but I always like to hear
Yeah.
what people themselves are passionate about, and what they often, I'm usually brought in when they presume there's a restriction to what they're able to manifest based on board of trustees, based on
Yeah.
all of those systems. I'm the parallel player. I'm the quarterback that needs to hear what your DNA is and what your passions are so that I can fit it in representatively without restricting any of the no don'ts. So I would love to speak to her again. We had a brief conversation when we were there, but based on how much she inspires you and the way in which you laud her, you have a lot of professors in her capacity, leaders in her capacity, that presume to, not her specifically, but that presume to
Yeah.
be relegated or minimized. And you want to say, there's no God in this. This is you. So you can understand the guidelines of systems, but you have the absolute right to make potent what you think needs to be made potent as an individual, as a
Yeah.
citizen, right? And then find ways to merge those things.
I love that. You have the absolute right to make potent what you choose to be potent.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the word legacy, and I know people are always curious. And I mean, clearly, you have figured out how to create your legacy. How do you encourage others to define that? I know we've been talking in and around that as it relates to culture and being open and being curious and learning about yourself. But then, how do you turn that into a legacy that really survives you, in this lifetime?
It's
How do you
interesting.
encourage people?
Well, first of all, who are you? And
Yeah.
what matters to you, and how is that defined, and where's the flexibility? We all have a marrow. Our marrow has an inner voice. It's the voice that babies have until someone starts saying no, don't, no, don't for them.
Yep.
So come with it. And then somewhere around when you're an older person and you want to revamp, then they're back at who they were when they were babies. That voice always exists, right? What is that? That's the work I like to do with people, whether it's on a corporate, level, but really when we do these delegations and we peel back the layers and you want to say, whoever you are here is really all right. Now let's discover what that is. Are
Yeah.
you that person because of what's been trained or influenced? Or is that what tickles? Is that what makes you grin?
Yeah, I love that. Or that's what you fancy, right? Or makes you blush too. I love
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, I'm blushing now because, I know I always beat to a different drummer. My poor mother, bless her. I mean, because she did want life to be easier. She thought it would be easier, for me not to lose my me, but to be able to move it along. And in my day, my childhood, it still was what a lady did, what a female did,
Yeah.
there were all those things that were put there. And I'm right at the crux of when you start to do it the way you feel. And my father was not here in my latter years, latter adolescent years. And he comes from a family on that side where you do kind of follow your inner voice and your
Yeah.
marrow. And my grandmother, who was a very quiet but very stately person, just sort of affirmed me. My paternal grandmother, she said, "You know, you're very smart. You know, take care of yourself." Though she said, "You know, take care of yourself." She could, and she didn't mean just intellectually smart. She meant intuitively
Yeah.
clear.
I
You
love
know,
that, intuitively clear about you, and able to discern and judge for yourself. And actually, I love that. I mean, all of this is kind of wrapping around the same theme around legacy. And legacy is not just, when people think of legacy, it's like, oh, what's the one big thing that I'm going to establish and like put out there so that it survives me, in my lifetime. I completely agree with you. I think it goes back to similar, although I know you and I have gotten there on different paths, but I feel like the work is similar in transformation. So if I think about having worked in organizations and joining them as a leader of people at a time um, where they were either poised to grow or die as an organization, if I think about that. And it really is about getting real clarity around who they are as a company and as leaders and what they stand for, and really grounding the strategy of growth or turnaround based on that. And
correct.
then, I think about, you're making me just think about my life in retrospective. And I know we talked about this when we met the last time. I think about my calling, maybe is a different way of how I say my authentic paragraph. And, when people go, well, how do you end up like doing what you've done in your career? It's not like I, I followed the pathway my parents raised me in the US, which was be a doctor because we want you to be successful in this country. But to me, I always think about, my calling. And I went through this exercise and did this work at the beginning of 2023 after I left my last, I'll call it corporate gig, right, in a large corporation. And I've always been doing what I was meant to do. And I think
Mhm.
about to profoundly and joyfully connect people to one another in service to creating opportunity. And I've been doing that my entire life, whether it's like, what was I doing aside from going to school in high school? Every organization, whether it was student government, track or cross country club, community service at church, like how was that all happening and how can we become the best we can be and create opportunity for others? I think about that, and having served in large companies where I've had the chance to serve and support over 1 million frontline employees in my career and see them kind of elevate in terms of their career and their pathway in life. And just because it's not in the form of, hey, I'm going to go into another corporation and do this. I think when we met, it was really about how do I profoundly and joyfully connect people to one another. I think our common friend, Kenneth Morris Jr., like in service to creating opportunity. And I think, so as long as I know I'm in that space, that I'm meant to be doing that, and it doesn't matter who's judging other than me, right?
Well,
Like,
and it's what I took note of, because it wasn't necessarily where you had to be, but it was why you were there, what engaged you, and also how for Mr. Morris, your presence enabled him to feel at home when one would think he was in his authentic house by virtue of being an heir of the descendancy.
yeah,
But it's sometimes you don't feel authenticated in that, and so when you have other people in and around who believe in your mission, your message, your direction, your efforts, oh my god. So that's why I said we have to listen and observe, because your comrade, your kinfolk, your likeness may not always come in the ways you presume. It may not be your exact mirror,
100.
or people who share the same work or pathways, but you'll find yourself, that little microcosm of familiarity in someone else completely different. That's also what intrigues me and makes me fancy the work that I do. I know it's showing up. So if I
Yeah.
come authentic, then people will find their way to that.
I totally agree. It's just sage advice that people are looking for. How can they make a difference and how can they influence? How can they make an impact? And I think it's really be true to who you are, being comfortable in your own skin. And I think the other thing, You're reminding me of a conversation I had with another leader who I've known for 20 years, who I've learned from, in terms of like coaching and communication skills, which I've carried with me. And we think about the work of leadership, and there's a lot out there, right? You can go to a leadership program and you hear about employees. I'll just say this: talk about their experience with leaders. And Al is his name, and he's just said most leadership experiences, it's about leaders sucking the life out of people. That's how they are experiencing their day, versus a way that he experiences me. And I think the way I experience you is about breathing life into people.
Right.
And it
Right.
is about inspiring that energy that is not just yours naturally, but then helping, again, it's that confidence, or the confidence that people find within themselves. Are like, well, she sees me, then therefore I see me, right? And right on, I'm going to just get in there and be vulnerable for a little bit.
Right.
It's a thing. It's such great advice you're sharing. I'm like, you're making me think about that.
Well, but it's always present. Nothing is ever really new. It's that's why we have to preserve our journeys and everything. There's always a comrade. It circles around, and someone is willing to talk to you, reach you, and they're looking for you somehow or another.
Yeah.
And for me, that is also very, very exciting. And so how do we make sure that we know who we are and are buoyant when there are aspects that are about to change? Because that's going to happen.
That's right. I think that is a guarantee around being, I love this, being buoyant. That's another good nugget, because the world around us, life wherever we are, is dynamic. And how
Right.
can we expect things to always be the same?
That's
There's
right.
no way. And
Well,
I think buoyant, yeah.
want it to be. I mean,
I
think
mean,
fundamentally you can have ethics that are
yeah,
core, but I think the proof of those things are how that they can be realized many ways. That's the affirmation.
that's right. Well, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. I always love to ask kind of these last fun, I'll put in the vein of pop culture questions, because you are such a worldly person. I know Louisville has been home for over 13 years, home base, as well as Belize,
Please. And I'm
and
always a New Yorker.
always a New Yorker. I
Always a
mean,
New
I feel like, I lived in New York for a few years. I feel like I was meant to be a New Yorker, more so an LA gal, although I think I identify with both. But I'd love to just hear about, all right, when you do have downtime, what are you loving these days? What are you loving eating? What are you loving reading, watching, listening to? What's kind of new in that pop culture space of yours?
Well, first of all, let me apologize for all the beeping.
I think you're
Because
getting a lot of mail.
yeah, yeah, and it's because I'm landing and so many things are going on, but I can't not. It's almost like being
I
in
hear you.
like in a station. So that's going to be my reality for a minute. And most people know I don't own a phone. So when they're trying to reach me, they're reaching me as if they're hitting redial, redial, redial
Right.
on a computer. So forgive that. Um, your question is, what do I do with my downtime?
Yeah. And what are you loving? Like, I always love getting advice from people, like, what are you loving reading or listening to these days? Watching, if you actually watch anything online or on any kind of streaming service, or any kind of new food that you've like discovered.
When I'm abroad, you can't get a lot. I mean, I don't
Okay.
have a television on when I'm abroad because I'm really not interested in the news feed right now.
Right.
It just sort of
No one is. Right.
yeah. So, but I do find myself, and it probably started mostly or with a binge worthy during 2020. I will just download a series of documentaries or episodes of or series of programs or shows I hadn't seen, just sometimes to escape and also to be informed. I love a lot of the documentaries and the storytellings and biopics that have been revealing this. So there's one that I just saw in March on Amazon Prime called Unladylike. It's a,
Ooh.
it's a tribute to women of historic note. And I have to say, the terminologies that we use now that we presume are contemporary are not.
No.
It's amazing. This one came out in 2020, but I just saw it during this past March. And it's a series of, I don't know, 30 women, 12 minutes apiece, or something like that. Series 1, 2, 3, and 4. And women from the late 1700s to now, using terminologies that we use now. We don't know enough. We think that everything just started. And that for me is fascinating. And you realize the evolution of a voice,
Interesting.
and not enough lessons. I'm glad that the segments, each episode is only 12 minutes, because I could send clips to people who may not sit down for a whole hour and a half like I might.
Yeah.
I do like shows that discover and unveil and contribute to transformations. That's just my kind of like pastime stuff. But I think right now it's designing the delegation work, or the immersions, or the sabbaticals, or the affirmations, or the restorations, or the transformations that I can under my wheelhouse for individuals that need them, individuals and or groups. Young people have been more recent just because of spring break and trying to find the rhythm and the budgets, because interestingly enough, those dollars are not set aside for young lives to discover. People figure they can do it later, and it's essential now. And also discerning between colleagues of mine who needs to be away, who needs a new transformation.
Yeah.
And then what will you, anytime you leave me, we're having a one-on-one to determine how much of what you experienced in the last 8 or 9 days here abroad are you ready to implement, and how can I help you do that?
I love that. Well, I mean, I think you're creating culture along the way when that happens, because it's very curated in terms of the groups that you bring together, but then it's very personal for each person when they
Well,
leave these delegations.
That's why it's invitational in a sense,
Yeah.
because I know who needs to be there, and they need to be there without the distraction of whatever.
Right.
And so, and I'm private. I'm a private person, and very often there are people who are in positions, and they just need to be able to be their full selves without risk.
That's right.
So I curate them as if it were me.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to find you?
The best way to find me, I'm on LinkedIn as Ambassador Shabazz. But also you can write to the Hours Project, all underscore one word, the Hours, OURS project.globe@gmail.com.
Okay. We will include that in the show notes. Obviously, people can find you via LinkedIn as Ambassador Shabazz, and then the Hours Project underscore or .globe@gmail.com. We will include that in the notes.
Right. And I would say for any of them, if I may add, that they actually write in the subject line CultureCast interview, so I can make the association.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. CultureCast interview. Excellent. And for someone who's such a private person, I express my gratitude for spending this time not only with me, but with everybody else who's just super excited to be in this conversation with us. So
my pleasure. And stay fortified.
Absolutely. But I also just need to requote you. I mean, everybody, I'm going to inspire you because of our conversation with Ambassador Shabazz to find and live your authentic paragraph. I love that. And to authentically move the pendulum, right? That is what legacy is when I think about what we just talked about. And so with that, I am going to bid farewell to everybody on this call. Thank you so much for joining us. Find the notes on how to reach Ambassador Shabazz in the show notes. And then hopefully if you're around, you can join us next week. I'm actually spending time with Dan Duster, the great grandson of Ida B. Wells, next Tuesday at the same time, 1 p.m. CT. Who knew? So with that, everybody, great to see you. Thank you, Ambassador Shabazz, for joining us. There's some amazing people who have sent love and comments too. I just noticed them as we were talking. And then I'll see you backstage. But for everybody else, we'll see you later. Take care, everyone. Bye.